when meeting you, when shaking your hand, he said, "Mr. Director, I didn't think you'd show up. I know you've been trying to kill me." To which you responded?
I said, maybe I still am.
Please give a very warm welcome, an interlochen welcome to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Please have a seat. Welcome to Switzerland, Mr. Secretary.
Great to be with you. Great to have Springsteen. It's all good. Yeah.
Good to see you. You just released a book, Never Give an Inch. I read that book, and being a reporter and a journalist, I was getting a bit antsy because you don't seem to be a big fan of journalists or reporters. You call them in your book wolves and hyenas. And then I thought, that's not a perfect start for me.
You should have seen the first edit.
So we can be glad with wolves and hyenas, right?
Exactly.
Let's speak about, people who are probably more worrying and worrisome than journalists and reporters.
Indeed.
I said it in my introduction. I mean, you've been in security and in those circles for a long time, and you faced quite some, I wouldn't say dangerous people, but people with a certain reputation. Because it's such a funny story. You went to North Korea in 2018. You met Kim Jong-un. When meeting you, when shaking your hand, he said, "Mr. Director, I didn't think you'd show up. I know you've been trying to kill me." To which you responded?
I said, maybe I still am. It's worth that. It's interesting that comment. So you can imagine, I was preparing for this moment for months. Professionals at the CIA, professionals from the State Department, all trying to help me. Folks around the world. No senior Western American had spent significant time with Chairman Kim other than Dennis Rodman.
Yeah.
and so I was preparing, and so
which means a lot, right?
Which meant a lot, and so we thought there'd be a handful of things at the very beginning that he might say, and you should know that was not on the bingo card.
Oh, I can imagine. That wasn't in the memo then.
No, so that response was just like it was in the moment, and all through a translator.
Yeah.
So a little bit of time delay, and so that 4 seconds before he smiled was like, all right.
Let's put it that way. We're glad you're here.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. So is my wife. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But that leads me, to the question: how do you face people like that? How do you deal with people like that? Let's call them what they are: tyrants, dictators. Sometimes. Do you have a strategy? Did you have a strategy as director of the CIA and also as Secretary of State?
In the moment. It's worth remembering that just a handful of weeks before that, there had been an American returned home who died from his captivity in North Korea, Otto Warmbier, and that he was still at that point holding 3 Americans. So we had a hostage issue that we were anxious to resolve as well. But President Trump had thought, all the previous efforts to convince previous leaders of North Korea and Chairman Kim to give up the nuclear weapons program had failed. Maybe having a senior level meeting with him might achieve that. How could we lay out a strategy to do that? So that was our mission. The second was to make very clear that we were resolved. We were resolved to stand with the South Koreans and the Japanese. We were going to do everything we could to deter his aggression. But so long as we were able to do that, all the while trying to find a pathway to convince them that he and his people would be better off without their nuclear weapons than with them, was the agenda. That was the objective, which we, in the end, were unable to achieve.
And that is an objective that you bring across quite clearly in your book as well. Don't, be on the defensive, don't appease, go on the offense, and deter. Is that something we should be doing with people like Vladimir Putin as well, for example?
Oh, of course. I stare at what's taking place in Europe today, and when I was a young soldier, I patrolled the then East German border. Mm-hmm. So I ran my M1 tank up and down, stared at the East German border guards, would have never dreamed that we'd end up in this place that we are today, with Vladimir Putin controlling a significant piece of a European nation. And that means we lost deterrence. And one of the things that I was so frequently reminded of during my time in government service was that deterrence is always temporary, and it depends on not only absolute power, but perceived risk.
Okay.
And we can spend some time talking about that. I think what happened in the end of 21, when Vladimir Putin made the decision to invade Europe, I think his perception was that he could do so freely, or do so at relatively low cost, and successfully achieve one of his lifetime objectives, right? He believes Ukraine is part of Russia in his DNA. I've spent time with him. He'd say, Mike, you're from Kansas, right? Yes. He'd say, you think it's part of the United States? I'd say, yes. He'd say, why do you think that? And, you could explain it. But in the same way, he would have a historical explanation for why Ukraine was. So he believes this. And the only thing that had deterred him was the capacity of the West to convince him that the cost exceeded the benefit. And even as we sit here today, now 2 years and 4 months on into the kinetic component of this conflict, he's still not deterred. And that's what we, collectively, the West, have to get back. That's the first step towards resolving this, is you have to convince him that the cost of the continued destruction of Ukraine exceeds the benefit for him. And we've not done that.
Do you even fear, furthermore, that he might draw that red line a little bit further as well, going into NATO space, as some are really afraid of?
You bet. No, there's definitely that risk. If he is not deterred, he has every intention. Just as he believes that Ukraine is part of Russia, he believes that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest calamity of the last century. I mean, it's not propaganda. It's not propaganda. He believes this, and so do most of the senior leaders around him. It's inherent to their core ideology. And so, yes, there's real risk that this will expand if we don't impose real costs. And, I'm critical of the Biden administration here. They often pat themselves, I don't mean this politically at all. This is about security. They pat themselves on the back for having united NATO. And I just think about, if you're a Ukrainian mother, how does that feel? Oh, we got NATO united after you killed my kid. After you've destroyed much of my nation, after you've put the very existence of Ukraine at risk. No, deterrence needed to happen back in 21, when Vladimir Putin made this decision, and when the American intelligence community knew that he was going to invade, and we didn't get it done.
However, when ex-President Trump now says, Russia can do whatever the hell they want, that doesn't seem or sound like deterrence to me.
I would posit 4 years. I would posit not following tweets and press statements, but data. Vladimir Putin took a fifth of Ukraine under President Obama. He took 0% of Ukraine under President Trump. And he went after it again just months after we departed. That's data. That you can make whatever arguments you want, but we had him in a box. We had him deterred from continuing his intent, which when he took Crimea, he intended to take the rest of Ukraine, and I'm convinced Moldova and Transnistria and other places as well. But we had demonstrated that America was going to lead, and we were resolved. And I'm convinced that was the several things at play. The good Lord always, but the Trump administration's demonstrable willingness to impose real costs on Russia.
That brings us to an interesting point: the role of the U.S. In the world. Some people are worried that you might recede, or you might give away the position you had before. In your book, you write about it as well, of the idea of multilateralism, which is very interesting, the difference between how Europe perceives it and how the US perceives it. And you say, in the European space, it's always been an ethical imperative. On the other hand, for the US, it's always been clear that you have your sovereignty and interests first at heart. Isn't that a dilemma that gets bigger? And can you understand that people might be afraid of the US just getting a little bit out of the picture?
Yeah. No, the whole world should be afraid of the US abandoning its leadership position. I agree with that. We should, it is the case that and I don't mean this in a jingoistic way. I think it's the data set of the last post-Cold War era. Here we are on D-Day, right? 80 years after American-led Allied Expeditionary Forces with our British friends and our Canadian friends and many others alongside of us. But when America fails to lead, the world is more at risk. There is no doubt about that. And so we must. And that means American leaders, whatever political stripe, have to make the case to the American people about why that's in our best interest to do so, right? That's the argument of America first. For me, it is, this actually matters a lot to the world, but most of all, it matters to you sitting in Wichita, Kansas, my hometown, or to you sitting in Salt Lake City or LA or New York. If we get this right, then your grandchildren will live in a world that looks a lot like the one that I had the privilege to grow up in America. And if we get it wrong, it will look more like a model that Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or Nicolas Maduro would prefer. And we can't let that happen.
Speaking of Xi Jinping and speaking of China, you call President Xi the most dangerous man in the world.
Yeah.
Tell us why.
I think it's unequivocally true. So it is deeply problematic what Vladimir Putin is doing in Europe. It is horrific what the Iranians did to kill 1,000 Israelis in an attack out of Gaza. Those are deeply problematic. The only nation with both the capacity and the intent to undermine the very democracy, the very world order that we all have benefited from for the last 75 plus years is the Chinese Communist Party itself. It has scale, it has resources, it has innovative creativity, and it has a leader today that has made very plain that's his intention. Mm-hmm. And as a young cadet, I was taught evaluate your enemy's capacity and his intent. And Xi Jinping scores a 10 out of 10 in terms of risk on each of those.
You haven't always been the most popular with that view. Apparently, and you correct me if I'm wrong, President Trump once told you, shut up about China.
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, there might even have been an adjective in there. It's possible. But
it might have been.
But it's early afternoon. We're not at the bar, so here we go. I'll save the adjective for later. Look, it was.
I was too polite. To say.
You were no. It's very kind of you. He did. It was a moment, right? We were in the very beginnings of the pandemic, and the United States was deeply reliant on China to provide us with equipment, PPE, all the things the world demanded. And I was full on trying to convince the Western world of its need to confront China, and he asked me to take a break for a moment. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Were you inclined not to do it?
No. He got 270 electoral votes. I got 0, which he reminded me of a lot.
But you know that.
It was. Look, there's always. It's a complicated space, mm-hmm. And I was fine with the immediate needs. The fact that this is what we needed to do in that moment to keep the American people healthier and safer, and frankly, lots of our allies and friends as well. So no, I was fine with it in the moment.
Are you worried, looking into the future? We have a new round of tariffs that the actual or the president who is now in the White House, Joe Biden, puts in China 100% for electric cars, for example. Are you afraid of a new trade war?
I'm very concerned about it, but I don't fault President Biden. I fault Xi Jinping. We sometimes think, these are American actions, but the truth of the matter is we have a renegade nation that fails to comply with any of the normative requirements for international trade, right? And so the West's fault, we let them get out of hand, and when the World Trade Organization gave them a certain status, now the United States continues to give them what is colloquially called most favored nation trading set of rules. We should go back to just the central idea where it's going to be reciprocal, and that would be my model. I'm not a big fan of these tariffs. I think they present a lot of risks to middle-income people all across the world, and indeed trying to bring the next billion people out of poverty. So I am worried about that, but not just because the United States will place tariff on Europe, or Europe will place tariffs on American or Canadian goods or what have you, but because Xi Jinping will drive a trade model which forces nations to do their level best to protect them from this predatory activity, which are in fact hostile acts. I've said this, and I believe it with all my heart. The Chinese Communist Party considers themselves at war with you today. It's an economic war. And they are full on at it in every dimension. We could spend a lot of time going through it, but we should not be naive about the fact that the Chinese Communist Party's primary tool for gaining the hegemony that Xi Jinping desires isn't a big space program. It isn't a big set of aircraft carriers. It is to undermine the foundations of our institutions and our economies. And so that's the place we have to find tools to fight back. And sadly today, one of the few that is handy is tariffs.
Let that sink in for a moment. While we're kind of approaching a topic which is close to your heart, because it happens in your country, it is a crucial year for the United States. It's 150 days, almost to the day, until the election. There's going to be a race between a soon 82-year-old and a 76-year-old, without, the risk of sounding...
It's a young man compared
exactly,
to
exactly. Me as a youngster, no, without wanting to sound too ageist.
Yes.
Just, I'll come straight out of it. Doesn't the United States deserve a race between two younger men? Or women?
Oh, I'm an institutionalist. This is what the institutions have produced. And so I mean that. I believe deeply in our constitutional system. I just always turn back to that. And by the way, it yields poor results in lots of ways, many times. It often deals not poor, but suboptimal results. That's certainly true. But over the sweep of history, it delivers good outcomes. And I'm convinced it'll do so again here. And by the way, I'll say this too. Everyone talks about the American. I'm watching the EU elections that are coming up.
This Sunday.
Yeah. The United Kingdom's got one on our big holiday, which, great to pick the Independence Day for America, for the Brits to have their election. I thought that was handy. So there are lots of elections, right? The Indians have had their election. Mexico had its election just now, 2 days ago? Yeah. Lots of elections, which will have big impacts on how these nations interact in the months and years ahead.
However, one that we're really looking at is the one in the United States. And the Time magazine brought an interesting cover lately. What if, with the picture of Donald Trump, as we see it here. And funny enough, they repeated it with the picture of Joe Biden. What if? If I take that what if and ask you where the country is right now, from our perspective, or let's put it more personal, from my perspective, it seems more polarized than ever. It seems more aggressive than ever. The rhetoric from both sides have become very inflammatory. People are worried that those rifts are so big that it's going to continue to worsen the situation for a lot of Americans. Can you understand that worry?
I hear this a lot. I'm not sure I accept the predicate of the question. I remember our founding. They were shooting each other.
Okay, that's a high bar.
Well, we had not terribly long after that, we had a civil war where they were absolutely shooting at each other, and so you can chuckle because I get why you would find that modestly humorous. But the reality is, it's always been a rambunctious place in America. That seems fine to me. I'm untroubled by big ideas, crazy. That all seems fine to me. What you have to protect are the institutions that provide the guardrails for channeling these conversations. Right? That's what is important to protect. My real worry isn't that you have people on the far left. People in my own party who have a very different view on providing support to Ukraine. That seems fine to me. What matters is that we protect these central institutions, right? We've just had a very political trial where a Democrat judge prosecuted the Republican Party candidate and has now convicted him. In the city of New York, where you couldn't find a Republican juror to save your life. Right? That just undermines the perception for people in the world, I must say, but certainly for Americans, that our institutions are failing them. And that's what I worry about most. We had you all will recall this, we had this story about Hunter Biden's laptop, where a bunch of former intelligence officials, including 2 former directors of the CIA, come out in October, a month before an election, and say, this looks like Russian disinformation, when they knew it wasn't. Imagine as a former director of the CIA how much that undermines the capacity of the next director, Bill Burns today, and his successor to actually deliver for the American people because they don't trust these institutions. That's my big concern. It's not the noise and the tweets and the rhetoric. It's are we going to preserve the things that are fundamentally uniquely American that have kept us going for 270 plus years now? And if we lose those, I do feel like there's risk of it coming undone.
Allow me to turn that point around and speaking about worries and what people are maybe scared of as well. We have now someone who runs for office who's a convicted felon, who still has more than 90 felony counts, who, according to the Washington Post, has told more than 30,000 false or misleading statements during his 4 years of presidency. Can you understand that some people might worry to be, to face a president like that? And just to be clear, I'm not talking about Joe Biden here.
Yeah. That you're right, it would have been 60,000.
I haven't checked that fact checker.
Yes, and by the way, the Washington Post does more than 30,000.
Okay, but
nearly on a weekly basis.
But
this is important. Remember, it's the Washington Post that puts the Russia hoax in front of the American people for months and months. You should remember, you're citing as a primary source an organization, an institution that fundamentally failed America by saying that Donald Trump was a Russian asset for 2 years. And it now turns out this was just Secretary Clinton's campaign work. I mean, that's the reality. And no one's apologized at the Washington Post. No one has said, it just turns out we believed it, but we got it wrong. That's the generous proposition. These are the institutions that have become dangerously propagandistic. Mm-hmm. And so when I talked about wolves and hyenas, this is what I was referring to. Yeah. These are no longer neutral organs that are presenting news. And you all hear, every time I travel a lot, so I turn on CNN International, and I don't even know the America they speak about on that channel. I truly don't. It is leftist propaganda filtered through the White House, and no more reflects reality than the experience that I had for 4 years. I watched it every day. And so I would just ask, when you ask about President Trump, I would ask this very question simply. It's the old Ronald Reagan question. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And I think the people of Ukraine would say they were better off 4 years ago than they are today. I think the people of Israel and the Gulf states would say they were better off 4 years ago. And I'm very confident that most Americans will end up saying they were better off 4 years ago as well. And only time will tell if I'm right about that hypothesis.
Only time will tell. And maybe you can have a look right now. We're going to ask you, the public here, who would you wish to win the American election? We can live vote, and let's see what the
let's go.
Public,
Bring
let's
it on.
Go for it, and let's see the results.
Is it secret ballot? Or
Let's not get into the ballot topic, but we're going to solve that question right away, which brings me to a question of your future. Would you be ready and willing to serve for another administration of yes. President Trump? You were kind of toying with the idea of maybe running yourself. Yeah. Yeah. How do you see the next, the next administration, and are you ready for it?
Yeah. I'd be honored to go get the chance to serve again. If I thought I could make a difference, America's given me an awful lot. I'd be honored to go take another swing at it.
In what position?
Whatever President Trump thought made sense. I mean that in all seriousness. My wife and I deeply believe in America, and we believe in America's important role in the world. And if we can improve that just a little bit, or at least give a good shot at it, we'd go take another swing.
Let's have a look at the results. Let's see how our public votes. Who should win this year's presidential? Well, we have 74% until 26. We'll see how it turns out.
Here's my prediction: Donald Trump will overperform that number.
Oh, we'll have that on record. If he doesn't, will he accept the result? Will you?
Of course. Of course. Yeah.
You have been, I was quite amazed and really surprised to read that you were the only one in his core security circle who made it through 4 years without quitting or without getting fired.
That's a true statement.
How did you do that? And, and how...
magicians never tell their secrets.
Okay.
Yes. No, I'll be more serious about this, because it's actually an important question in many ways. Some of you have had a chance to serve. When you get that opportunity, you should savor every single second, and I did. There were lots of hard days. Make no mistake about it. It was a very unique administration. Frankly, I think every administration is unique in some ways. This one certainly was. No, I mean that in the best sense. I mean, it was the best sense. Think about who he brought. I was running a machine shop. I was running a machine shop in Wichita, Kansas in 2010. And a few years later, I'm the 70th Secretary of the United States of America. Like, promise you, the guys who were working the lathes and the mills in my machine shop, if you'd have walked out and said, hey, that guy over there, man, the guy running this place, he's going to be the Secretary of State, they would have just laughed. And appropriately so. He brought in a bunch of business people. Mm-hmm. He brought in a bunch of people who, he brought in a group of people who believed in America's Judeo-Christian founding. He brought in a deep set of people who had a core set of understandings that was unique and different from previous administrations. And so I think you can see our national security strategy was different as well. And so if you asked, how did I make it? The answer was just every day reminding myself and my two teams, my team at SER, my team at the State Department, reminding them that we had this incredible burden that sat on our shoulders every day and an enormous opportunity that flowed from that, mm-hmm. and to not lose 1 second. And so, you know, the noise would be all around you. You'd go on Meet the Press, and Chuck Todd would, he'd put up a tweet and say, Mr. Secretary, President Trump tweeted that his button is bigger than Chairman Kim's button. What do you make of that? And I'd take the bait. But I wouldn't take the bait. I would simply say, let me walk you through what we're doing to make sure that North Korea doesn't conduct nuclear tests. And of course, they didn't. And so I always go back to, like, where did we fail? And we had our failures, but the places we actually delivered outcomes that mattered to America and the world. And so all the noise, all the Washington chatter didn't impact me for 1 second.
On a personal level, that's a lot of responsibility as well. And maybe, that's something we don't often ask people in that position, but were you ever overwhelmed by that burden, and how did you deal with that? Because it is quite a lot.
No, there were definitely days when you were burning at both ends, trying to make sure you were managing all of the different challenges that you had. I never felt overwhelmed. I think part of that is, I mentioned this before, I'm an evangelical Christian. When on my hardest days, I would pray, and that would give me the encouragement to know this is bigger than me. So I had that to fall back upon, to rely upon. But I also knew it was not permissible to be overwhelmed, mm-hmm. right? You got a lot of things to do. Like, if you're overwhelmed, what's your team going to do? And so the leadership things that I had learned as a young soldier and then running 2 small businesses, those were the things I always turned back to. How do I get my organization to go deliver the outcomes that President Trump and America is asking me to do? And that would always just take me away from being overwhelmed and focus back on mission set.
Speaking about that young soldier, that brings us to our last question. We went deep into the archives and we found a photo.
All right. I'm going to be really skinny in this picture.
From West.
I knew it. Wow.
West Point.
There you go.
Where you were first in your class.
Same calic. It's still
1986. A young Richard Pompeo. And the text is quite funny because it says, Pomps was a cadet who always had a time for a good party.
Yeah.
Sophistication, class, and a touch of sarcasm, as we've seen today as well, characterized his stay here. And then, success is certain to follow him wherever he goes. Which brings me to the next and last question. Will we ever see a president of the United States, Mike Pompeo? If you're so successful.
It's impossible to answer a question like that. Only the good Lord and my wife can impact that.
Only those two. We're very curious to see where the good Lord and your wife takes you in the future. And we thank you very much for your visit.
Thank you very much.
Secretary Mike Pompeo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.